My name is Father Adrian, and I have dedicated my entire life to the service of God. From a young age, I felt the calling to the priesthood and never hesitated to follow that path. I spent decades preaching about faith, teaching about life after death, and preparing people for the moment when they would finally meet the Lord. I never feared death. On the contrary, I believed that when my time came, I would be received with peace, surrounded by divine light and angels. I always taught that death was not the end, but rather the beginning of eternity alongside God. I was sure of that until I died. When my last breath faded away in the hospital, I felt a deep relief. The pain of cancer disappeared, and my consciousness began to detach from the world. For a moment, I was certain I was on my way to heaven. But then, instead of the celestial light, I awoke in an absolute void. There was nothing, no presence, no sound, no feeling of welcome, only an infinite darkness and an oppressive silence. At first, I tried to calm myself, believing that it was just a transition. But as the seconds or perhaps hours passed, I began to feel something terrible. I was alone. Time did not exist there, and a growing sense of despair began to take hold of me. Something was very wrong. I tried to pray. My words had always been my connection to God, the path that led me to His presence. But there, the words did not come out. I tried to remember the prayers I had recited my whole life, the psalms I proclaimed so many times at the altar, but it was as if something erased them before I could even finish. The darkness around me was not just the absence of light, it was something alive, conscious, overwhelming. It was as if I were being watched by something I couldn't see. A terrible sensation took over me. What if no one came to get me? What if that was all there was after death? The faith that had sustained me throughout my life began to shatter inside me. I always spoke of God's mercy and justice, but there, in that endless abyss, a single question echoed in my mind: have I been forgotten? It was then that I realized I was not alone. At first, there were only whispers coming from all directions, in a language I did not know, a distorted murmur, as if many voices were speaking at the same time, but without forming comprehensible words. My instinct was to shrink back, to protect myself, but I had no body. There was nothing in me to move, yet I still existed. Shadows began to appear. They had no defined shape, only distorted figures that seemed made of a fabric oscillating between smoke and flesh. They approached slowly, gliding through the void as if they were part of it. My heart, if it still existed, would have pounded in pure terror. I knew that this was not good. The survival instinct screamed inside me, but how can one run when there is nowhere to go? I tried to scream, but my voice did not exist there. I had no mouth, no lungs, but I felt the despair growing inside me. The shadows moved slowly, as if savoring the moment. Their whispers grew louder, and even without understanding the words, I knew what they meant. It was mockery, derision. I was a priest, a man who had dedicated his life to God, but there, in the darkness, these entities ridiculed me. I tried to cling to any remnant of faith. I tried to remember that God was greater than anything, but the brutal truth hit me. I never felt His presence there. Where was He? Why did He allow this to happen? I always preached that at the hour of death, we would be received by angels, but there was only horror. It was then that one of the shadows finally touched me. The sensation was indescribable. It wasn't physical pain because I had no body, but it was as if something inside me had been forcibly torn away, as if my soul were being ripped apart, corrupted. A piercing cold enveloped me, but it wasn't an ordinary cold. It was the absence of everything. The shadow that touched me seemed to feed on my fear. The more I sank into despair, the stronger it became. I felt a tug, as if I were being dragged into something even deeper and darker. And in that moment, I knew if I were taken, there would be no return. I would be forgotten, erased, devoured. Hell was real, but it wasn't like the paintings and sermons had described. It was much worse. It was a place where God was not present. I wanted to fight, to resist in some way, but there was nothing to hold on to, no place to run. I was completely at its mercy. All my life, I taught that evil was something external, something we could avoid with prayer and devotion. But there, before those shadows, I realized that I had never truly understood its real nature. Even evil did not need fire nor physical torture. It was emptiness. It was oblivion. It was an abyss where everything that made someone a living soul slowly disappeared. And I was falling. The shadows continued to whisper, drawing ever closer, and in that moment, I felt something worse than fear. I felt that I was being erased. My memories, my identity, everything seemed to dissolve gradually, like ink being diluted in dirty water. If that continued, I would no longer be Father Adrian. I would be nothing. And then something pulled me away. It was quick, as if an invisible force had yanked me from that place. In an instant, the shadows vanished, and I was thrown back, crossing that dark void as if carried by an invisible current. The horror still pulsed within me, but for the first time since I died, I felt that I was not heading towards something worse. The darkness began to dissipate around me, and suddenly, I was above the earth. It was as if my consciousness were floating over the world, observing everything from a perspective I had never had before. I could see cities, people, churches, and for the first time, I thought that maybe, finally, I was going where I should be. But I was wrong. What I saw next was even more terrifying than the void. As I descended upon the earth, I realized that it wasn't just a superficial vision. I saw beyond what human eyes could see. At first, it seemed like the world as it always was. People hurrying about, children playing, churches with their doors open. But when I looked more closely, I saw something terrible. A darkness was crawling along the streets. It wasn't a physical darkness, but rather a spiritual one, like a black mist infiltrating everything. It coiled around people without them noticing, entered homes, spread inside churches. It was something alive, stealthy, and to my horror, no one noticed. The faithful continued to pray, the pastors and priests continued to preach, but they did not see what I saw. It was as if they were anesthetized, blind to what was really happening around them. Then I looked at the churches. Some were empty, abandoned, forgotten. Others were full, packed with the faithful, but something was wrong, very wrong. The sermons I heard did not speak of repentance, of holiness, of the need to truly seek God. Instead, the preachers spoke only what people wanted to hear, soft, comforting messages, promises of prosperity and success. The congregation smiled, waving their hands to the music, but their eyes were empty. They were not there to seek transformation. They were there only for what they could receive. And the darkness was there, hidden among them, feeding on that false devotion. The presence of God was not there. The Holy Spirit had withdrawn, and no one noticed. I wanted to shout, to warn them, but I could not. All I could do was observe, feeling a despair I had never experienced before. The more I looked, the clearer it became what was happening. The enemy was not destroying the church from the outside, but from within. I saw pastors and priests who had begun their ministries with passion and zeal, but who over the years had grown cold. Some became corrupted by money, preaching only what attracted more followers and donations. Others sought influence, wanting to be respected by the world, and so began to shape their messages so that no one would be offended. They still spoke of God, but He was no longer at the center of their lives. And then there were those who had simply lost their faith. They still wore their priestly vestments, still conducted services and masses, but their hearts were empty. To them, the church had become just an institution, a job, a lifeless tradition. And the worst part? No one noticed. Then I looked at those who still tried to keep their faith pure. I saw churches that followed ancient traditions, that preserved rituals and sacraments with rigor. But even there, another problem revealed itself. Many were so focused on form, on customs, on rules, that they had forgotten the true purpose of faith. They recited prayers, performed sacred ceremonies, but their hearts were cold. There was no life, no passion, just a mechanical fulfillment of what had been taught for generations. It was as if they believed that following the rites was enough, without realizing that God did not want just words and gestures, but a heart surrendered to Him. I saw priests and bishops who were proud of preserving tradition, but who deep down had lost their real connection with Christ. They trusted in what they had built, but did not realize that without God, all of it was nothing more than an empty shell. The vision continued, and the more I saw, the tighter my heart grew. Evil was not only in the temples, but everywhere. I saw families sitting at the table, but each one trapped in their own distraction, staring at screens without exchanging meaningful words. Fathers and sons lived together but were not connected. Husbands and wives shared the same home, but their hearts were distant. I saw young people immersed in a virtual world, desperate for recognition, but unable to perceive the emptiness growing inside them. The black mist I had seen earlier in the streets intertwined with them, clouding their minds and hearts, driving them apart, and more importantly, driving them away from God. Everyone followed their routines without noticing the invisible chains that imprisoned them. The world was immersed in an illusion. I looked to the sky, hoping to see some sign of God, but he seemed distant. I always taught that if we cried out to him, he would answer, but then I understood. The problem was not that God had withdrawn. It was the world that had stopped listening. Hearts had grown hard, too busy to realize how far they had drifted from him. I saw people who called themselves Christians, yet lived as if God were just a distant idea. They prayed out of habit, went to church out of tradition, but their lives did not reflect the faith they professed. And the black mist, that invisible and living presence, walked among them. It was then that a thought struck me like lightning. The enemy's greatest deception was not to destroy faith, but to make them believe that they still had it. In the midst of all this darkness, I began to wonder if there was still hope. Was everything lost? It was at that moment that my vision changed again. I began to see small points of light scattered around the world. They were few, but they were there. When I looked closer, I saw that they were groups of believers, small, hidden communities of people who still sought God with all their heart. They were not in the grand, luxurious temples, nor at the religious events that attracted crowds. They were gathered in homes, in basements, in simple churches, often persecuted, rejected by the world. But in them, there was something I had not seen anywhere else, the living presence of God. They were the ones who did not bow to illusions, who did not exchange truth for something convenient. They were the last to carry the flame of true faith. Some were spiritual leaders, but most were ordinary people who had simply not allowed their devotion to become empty. They truly loved God, and around them, the black mist could not come near. It tried, but it was repelled by the light that shone within them. The presence of God was still there. I saw these believers being ridiculed, called radicals, outdated. I saw many being persecuted, silenced, some even killed because of their faith. But despite everything, they did not give up. Their prayers were genuine, their hearts were surrendered. And even though they were few, they were still proof that God had not abandoned the world. It was then that I saw him, Jesus Christ. But he was not like the images I had venerated all my life. He was not merely a serene man with gentle eyes and a calm expression. He was pure glory, intense light, fire, and absolute holiness. His presence was overwhelming, and I fell face down to the ground without strength to sustain even a thought. I felt small, unworthy. It was not just the fear of being before something so grand, it was the certainty that before him, everything I was had been exposed. All the years of priesthood, all the words I preached, all the times I spoke of him without truly knowing him, all of it came to light in that instant. He looked at me, and he asked only one question, a single sentence. But it hit me harder than anything I had ever experienced. "You served me, but did you really know me?" My world collapsed. I had dedicated myself to the church, but had I truly dedicated myself to him? I taught about God, spoke of his justice, conducted rites and masses, but had I ever truly sought him with all my heart? I realized the cruel truth. I'd spent my life serving the institution, but not Christ himself. I preached so that others might know him, but did I know him myself? Tears streamed down my face, but they were not of emotion, they were of shame. I wanted to answer, to shout that I had always served God, that I had dedicated my life to him, but the words did not come. Because deep down, I knew the answer. I served the church, the rites, the doctrines, the traditions, but had I truly sought him? Had I known him beyond words and sacred texts? The truth hit me like a cutting blade. I thought I was safe, that my faith was solid, but the moment I looked into Christ's eyes, I realized that my faith was incomplete. And I was not alone. Thousands, perhaps millions of people lived the same way. They followed a set of rules, practiced religious acts, but never experienced a real relationship with God. Before I could say anything, he gave me an order. You must go back and warn them. Terror seized me. Go back? After everything I had seen, after feeling his presence, I did not want to. I wanted to stay there, to learn, to redeem myself. But Jesus was firm. I had to warn. Some people would listen, others would not. But I had to speak the truth before it was too late, before the darkness consumed even more hearts. I wanted to argue, to beg, to remain there, but there was no choice. Suddenly, everything disappeared. I awoke with a violent gasp, as if I had been thrown back into my body. The pain returned instantly. My lungs burned, my vision was blurry, and I could hear voices around me, my family, the doctors, the fellow believers who were praying for me. They were in shock. To them, I had died. The monitors had stopped. My heart had ceased. But against all logic, I returned. At first, everything seemed like a blur, as if I were trapped between two worlds. My body was there, but my soul still felt the weight of what I had seen. The whispers of the shadows still echoed in my mind. The voice of Christ still burned within me. And I knew I could not simply pretend that nothing had happened. When I managed to gather my strength, I tried to recount what I had seen, but it wasn't easy. Some listened with reverence, with tears in their eyes, feeling the weight of the truth I carried. Others looked at me with skepticism, as if I had been the victim of delirium on the brink of death. Even within the church, some doubted. God would never allow something like this, they said. But I knew what I had seen. And even those who believed few were willing to change. Jesus' words echoed in my mind. Some will listen, others will not. But I had to try. I could no longer remain silent. The following Sunday, I took the pulpit and spoke to my congregation. I told everything, leaving nothing hidden. I spoke about the void, the shadows, the corruption within churches, the black mist that was crawling through the world. I recounted about the faithful who still kept the flame of true faith alive, and about the question Jesus asked me. The silence in the church was absolute. Some people wept, others looked at me with a mix of fear and doubt. But what frightened me the most were those who simply stood up and left. They did not want to listen. They did not want to believe. Perhaps it was because admitting the truth would require change, and change hurts. I always preached that Christ was the truth, but I realized that many do not want the truth. They want comfort. In the days that followed, I saw the effects of my testimony. Some people truly began to seek God in a way they never had before, but others drifted even further away. My own fellow believers, some priests and religious leaders I had known all my life, began to look at me with suspicion. It was easier to believe that I was delirious than to accept that something was deeply wrong. But I knew I could not go back. Because I had seen. I saw what was happening in the spiritual world. I saw the deception spreading. I saw the separation between those who truly served God and those who only thought they served Him. And I knew that this separation would only grow. The days passed, but the weight of that experience never left me. I tried to follow my routine, to continue serving, but nothing seemed the same anymore. When I looked at people, I saw the mist that enveloped them. When I entered the church, I felt the absence of the Spirit where I once presumed He would be. My faith was no longer theoretical, no longer just a set of rules and traditions. Now I knew that the only thing that truly mattered was to truly seek Christ, not the Christ of pretty words, of rote prayers, but the living, real Christ who transforms and demands surrender. And that brought me a disquieting certainty. Most people are not ready for what is to come. And now, what do I do with this? I ask myself that every day. Because this experience was not a dream. I died, I saw, and I returned because Jesus wanted me to warn. But will people listen? Some will. But the majority will continue living as they always have, unaware of what is happening around them. I do not know how long I will still be here. My body was already weak before, and now it seems even heavier. But as long as I breathe, I will continue speaking. Because one day, each of us will stand before Him. And when that day comes, there will be no more time for excuses. Sometimes I wonder why I was chosen to see this. Why me? I spent decades believing that I knew everything about God, about salvation, about faith. But when I stood before Christ, I realized that I had spent my entire life looking at the wrong thing. I believed that being a priest, following rituals, teaching doctrine was enough. But it wasn't. Because God does not want just our religiosity, He wants our heart. I see churches full. I see services taking place. But how many of those people truly know God? How many truly seek Him? After what I saw, I know that the answer is terrible. Most do not seek. They think they do. They think they live for Him. But they are merely comfortable in their own illusions. I do not know how much time I have left. Death has already taken me once, and I know it will come again. But when that moment comes, I hope it will be different. I hope that this time, I will truly be ready. Because now I understand that serving God is not just being part of the church. It is not just following traditions or knowing the scriptures. It is about knowing Him. And that is what I want until the last day of my life. I know that many will not believe what I have written here, but that does not matter. My duty is not to convince, it is to warn. The rest is up to each one to choose. And now, after everything you have heard, do you really know God? Or do you only think you know Him? This experience was a warning. And if it were you, would you be ready? I want to know your opinion, so leave your comment down below. If you have already had a similar experience or felt something strong while watching this video, share it with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss new content that can transform your view of life, faith, and what awaits us beyond death. It really helps the channel grow and spread this message to more people. And if this account made you reflect, don't leave just yet. Watch the next video that is appearing on the screen, a different, impactful testimony that might change your way of looking at the spiritual world. See you there. Stay with God, and until the next video.